Chapter 5. Week after week went by, and Kristin made ready in her heart to bear to Erland the dead man's message. Do it she would for sure, but she thought it a hard matter. And meanwhile there was so much that must be done at home on the manor. From day to day she put herself off with fresh pleas for delay. At Whitsuntide, Ramborg Lavransdatter came back to Formo. The children she had left behind at Diffrin. They were well, she answered when Kristin asked after them. The two young maids had wept bitterly and sorrowed over their father. Andrus was too young to understand. The youngest, Simon Simonson, was thriving, and there was good hope that in time he would grow big and strong. Ramborg came once or twice to the church and to her husband's grave. Otherwise, she didn't stir from her home. But Kristin went south to her as often as she could. She wished now from her heart that she had known more of her young sister. The widow looked most childlike in her weeds. Frail and undergrown her body seemed in the heavy dark blue habit. The little three-cornered face showed sallow and thin among the linen bands, under the black woolen veil, falling in stiff folds from the crown of her head almost to the hem of her skirt. And she had dark rings under her big eyes, where the pupils ever gazed out now, wide and coal black. At the hay harvest there came a week when Kristin could not go to see her sister. From her haymaking folk she heard there was a guest with Ramborg at Formo, Jamelt Halvardsson. Kristin remembered that Simon had spoken of this man. He owned a great manor not far from Diffrin, and he and Simon had been friends from childhood up. A week on in the harvesting it set in to rain, and Kristin rode down the dale to her sister. Kristin sat talking of the untoward weather and of the hay, and asked how things went here on Formo, when Ramborg said of a sudden, "It will be for John now to see to all that. I am going south in a few days' time, Kristin." "Ah, poor soul, you long for your children, I can well believe," said Kristin. Ramborg rose and walked to and fro in the room. "You shall hear somewhat that will make you wonder," the young woman said in a little. "Soon you and your sons will be bidden to a betrothal ale at Diffrin. I gave Jamelt my yes ere he went from here, and Gert would hold my betrothal feast." Kristin sat dumb. Her sister stood, black-eyed and pale, gazing fixedly at her. At length Kristin said, "I see. Not for long will Simon have left you widowed. I had thought you grieved for him so sorely. But it is true you are your own mistress now." Ramborg made no answer. Then, in a little, Kristin asked, "Does Gert know you are minded to wed again so soon?" "Yes." Ramborg walked to and fro again. "Helga counsels it. Jamelt is rich." She laughed. "And Gert is so clear-sighted a man. I think he has seen long since how wretchedly we lived together, Simon and I." "What are you saying?" cried Kristin. "No one else knew that you lived unhappily together," she said a little after. "No one has seen anything other than friendship and goodwill between you. Simon gave you your way in all things, gave you all your heart's desired, ever kept your youth in mind, and was heedful that you should have joy of it and be spared all toil and trouble. His children he loved, and showed you every day his thankfulness for that you bore him those two." Ramborg smiled scornfully. Kristin answered vehemently, "All right. If so be you have any reason to say you lived badly together, then for sure 'tis not Simon that bears the blame." "No," said Ramborg, "I will take the blame, if you dare not." Kristin sat in amazement. "Do you know what you are saying, sister?" she said at length. "Yes, in sooth I do," answered Ramborg. "But I know you don't know it. You have thought so little about Simon that I well believe it is news for you. You counted him good enough to turn to when there was need of a helper that had gladly borne red-hot iron for your sake. But never did you fling so much thought Simon Anderson's way as to ask how much it cost him. I was left free to joy in my youth. Blithely and gently Simon lifted me into the saddle and sent me forth from him a-visiting and junketing. Even as blithely and gently he welcomed me again when I came home. He patted me as he patted his dog and his horse. He didn't miss me wherever I went." Kristin had risen. She stood by the board without moving. Ramborg wrung her hands so that the joints cracked, going and coming through the room. "Jamelt," she said, something more calmly, "I have known for a long time what he thought of me. I saw it even while his wife was still living. Not that he knows he has betrayed himself in word or deed, don't believe that. He grieved so himself over Simon, came to me time and again, and would have comforted me. It's true, it was Helga who said to us both she thought that now it were fitting if we... And I don't know what I should wait for. I shall never be more comforted or less than I now am. Now I have a mind to try how it is to live with a man who has kept silence and has thought on me for long years. I know all too well how it is to live with one who keeps silence and is always thinking about another." Kristin stood as before. Ramborg stopped in front of her with flashing eyes. "You know it is true, what I have said." Kristin went out of the room quietly, with bowed head. While she stood in the rain in the courtyard, waiting for the serving man to lead forth her horse, Ramborg came to the door of the hall. She gazed at her elder sister with black, hostile eyes. It was not until the next day that Kristin remembered what she had promised Simon if Ramborg should wed again. So she rode to Formo once more. This seemed to her no easy thing to do, and the worst of it was that she knew she could not say anything that would be a help or comfort to her young sister. To Kristin, this match with Jamelt of Ailin seemed rashly made, with Ramborg in the mind she was now in. But Kristin saw it would be of no use for her to gainsay it. Ramborg was sullen and peevish, and would scarce answer the other. She would in no wise consent that her stepdaughter should come to Jorungard. "Nor do I think things are so ordered at your manor that it were wise to send a young maid there." Kristin answered mildly that in that Ramborg might well be right, but she had given Simon her word to make the offer. "Aye, and if so be Simon in his fever wanderings did not understand it was an affront to me to ask you this, you at least must know that it is an affront to tell me of it," answered Ramborg. And Kristin had to return home from her fruitless errand. Next morning promised fair weather, but when her sons came in to the morning meal, Kristin said they must get in the hay without her. She was setting forth on a journey, and she would probably be gone for some days.
"I think to go north to Dover, to seek out your father," she said. "It is in my mind to pray him to forget the troubles that have been between us, to ask when he will come home to us."
The sons flushed red. They scarce dared look up, but she noticed well how glad they were. She drew Munin to her and bent her face over him.
"You scarce remember your father, I think, little one."
The boy nodded dumbly with shining eyes. One after another, the other sons looked over at their mother. She was younger of face and fairer than they had seen her for many years. She came out into the courtyard a little later, clad for the journey in her church-going clothes, a black woolen habit broidered with blue and silver about the neck and sleeves, and black sleeveless hooded cloak, since it was high summer. Narkvi and Gout had saddled her horse and their own. They would go with their mother. She said nothing against it, but she spoke little with her sons as they rode north across the gorge and up into Dover. For the most she was silent and lost in thought, and if she talked with the young lads, it was of other things than of her errand. When they were come so far they could see up the hillside and had sight of the house roofs of Haugen against the sky, she bade the lads turn back. "You can understand well that your father and I may have much to say to one another that we can best speak of alone." The brothers nodded. They bade their mother farewell and turned their horses homewards. The wind from the mountains swept cool and fresh against her hot cheeks as she came up over the last rise. The sun shone golden upon the small grey houses, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The corn up here would soon be ripe. It showed fairly upon the small plots, shimmering and swaying in the wind. On all the stone heaps and over the hillocks, tall waving willow herb blossomed red, and in between were little haycocks. But on the farm no living thing was to be seen. Not even a dog came forth to give warning. Kristin unsaddled her horse and led it to the water trough. She had no mind to turn it loose up here, so she took it into the stable. The sun shone in through a great hole in the roof. Roof turves hung down in tatters from the beams, and there was no sign that any horse had stood there for many a long day. Kristin saw to her beast and went out into the courtyard again. She looked into the byre. It was dark and empty. She knew by the smell that it must have stood long deserted. Some skins of beasts were stretched upon the house wall to dry. A swarm of blue flies flew up, buzzing, as she drew near. At the north end of the house earth had been heaped up, and turf spread over it so that the house timbers were quite hidden. He had probably done it to keep in the warmth. She looked for nothing else but that the house would be locked fast, but the door flew open when she laid her hand upon the latch. Erland had not even barred his house. A noisome stench past bearing met her when she stepped in, the strong rank smell of skins and of the stable. The first feeling that rushed over her as she stood within his house was heartbreaking remorse and pity. This dwelling seemed to her most like a bear's winter lair. "Oh, Simon, Simon, you were right." The room was small, but it was choicely wrought, and had once been very fine. The fireplace had even a mason chimney above it, so that it wouldn't smoke into the room like the fireplaces in the hall house at home. But when she went to open the damper to clear the foul air a little, she saw the pipe had been blocked with slabs of stone. The glass pane in the window to the penthouse was broken, and had been stopped up with cloths. The whole room was floored with wood, but so thick with dirt was the floor that the planks could scarcely be seen. Not a cushion was there upon the benches, but weapons, furs, and old clothes lay strewn about. The filthy board was littered with leftovers of food, and flies buzzed high and low. She started, stood trembling, breathless, with thumping heart. In yonder bed, where it had lain when she was last here, lay something covered with a wadmal cloth. She didn't know what to think. Then she set her teeth, forced herself to go across and lift the cloth. It was but Erlend's coat of mail, his helm and shield. They lay covered up upon the bare bedboards. She looked towards the other bed. It was there they had found Bjorn and Ashild. 'Twas there Erlend slept now. Perhaps she herself would lie there tonight. But what must it have been for him to dwell in this house, to sleep here? Again, all else that she felt was drowned in pity. She went over to the bed. She saw it had not been made for many days. The hay under the sheet of hide had been lain upon till it was hard as stone. There was nothing in the bed save some sheepskins and a pair of wadmal-covered pillows, so foul that they stank. Dust and trash showered from the bedgear when she handled it. Erlend's resting place was no whit better than a horseboy's in a stable. Erlend, who could never have enough bravery about him. Erlend, who would don a silken shirt, velvet and fine furs on the least pretext, who chafed because she suffered his children to go clad in homespun wadmal on workdays, and never could abide that she herself should suckle them and take a hand herself with her serving women in the housework, like a cottar's wife, he said. Jesus! And it was he himself that had brought things to this. No, I will not say a word. I will take back all that I have said, Simon. You were right. He shall not live on here, the father of my sons. I will proffer him my hand and my mouth and pray him for forgiveness. 'Tis not easy, Simon, but you were right. She remembered the sharp grey eyes, their look, steadfast as ever, well nigh to the end. From out of the poor body, already beginning to waste away, there shone through his eyes his pure and shining spirit, until his soul was taken home like a blade withdrawn. She knew it was as Ramborg had said. Simon had loved her all these years. No day had gone by in these months since his death that she must think on him, and now it seemed to her that she had known it since before Ramborg ever spoke. She had been driven in this time to turn over again every memory she had of him for as long as she had known Simon Dar. All these years she had borne within her false memories of him who had been her hand-fasted man. She had tampered with these memories as a bad ruler tampers with the money, mixing base metal with the silver. When he set her free and took upon himself the blame for the breach of troth, she had told herself and believed that Simon Anderson turned from her with scorn in the moment he knew of her dishonour. She had forgotten that when he freed her that day in the nun's garden, then for sure he didn't think anything of her but that she was unstained and pure. But even then he was willing to bear the shame of her changefulness and revolt, craved only that her father should know it was not he who had willed the breach. And this too she knew now. When he had learned the worst and had stood up to save for her a semblance of honour in the world's eyes, had she been able to turn to him then, Simon would have taken her, even then, at the church door to be his wife. and he would have striven so to live with her that she should never have felt he had kept the memory of her shame. And none the less she knew, never could she have loved him. Yet all that Erland was not, and that she had raged to find he was not, Simon was. But then must she herself be a pitiable woman to murmur at her lot. Simon had given with a measureless bounty to her he loved, and she had thought surely that she too did the like. But when she took gifts at his hands, unthinking and unthankful, he had but smiled. She understood now that often when they were together he had been heavy of heart. She knew now that behind that strangely steadfast mien he had hidden sorrow. Then, flinging out a few jesting words, he would thrust everything aside and stand ready once more to guard, to help, and to give. She herself had raged, had stored up and brooded over every hurt, when she reached forth her gifts, and Erland didn't see them. Here in this room she had stood and spoken such brave words. "I went astray of my own will. Never will I cast blame on Erland, should the path lead over the cliff edge." She had said it to the woman she drove to death to make way for her love. Kristin moaned aloud, clasped her hands before her breast, and stood rocking. Ah, she had said it proudly. She would cast no blame on Erland Nicolausen if he grew weary of her, betrayed her, even forsook her. And if Erland had done that, it seemed to her she could have stood to her word. If he had betrayed her once and for all, then there had been an end. But he had not betrayed her, only failed her and made her live ever fearful and unsure. No, he had never played her false, but he had never sustained her, and she could see no end to it. Here she stood now, come to beg him to turn back to her, to fill her cup each day to the brim with unsureness and disquiet, with vain expectancy, with longings and fears and hope that broke in pieces. And it seemed to her she was worn out by him now. She didn't have the youth and the courage to live with him any more, and perhaps she would never grow so old that Erland could not play upon her fondness. Never so young that she could live with him in gladness, never so old that she could bear with him in patience. She had become a little weak woman, perhaps had always been. Simon was in the right. Simon and her father. They had been constant ever in one faithful love to her. For all she had trodden them down for the sake of this man, she herself could bear to live with no longer. Oh, Simon, I know well. You have never wished for vengeance on me at any time. But I wonder, Simon, if where you lie, you know not that now you are well avenged. No, she must busy herself with something, else she could not bear it. She set the bed in order, sought for a mop and a broom, but it seemed no such thing was in the house. She looked into the closet. Now she saw whence came the smell of the stable. Erland had made his horse's stall in there. But here the floor was swept and clean. The saddle and the gear that hung upon the wall were well kept and greased. Their rents were mended. Pity again drove all other thoughts away. Had he brought Soten in there, because he could not bear to be all alone in the house? Kristin heard steps in the penthouse. She stepped over to the glass pane. It was thick with dust and cobwebs, but she thought she could dimly see a woman. She pulled aside the cloth and peeped out. Out there a woman was setting down a milk can and a small cheese. She was old, lame, ugly, and poorly clad. Kristin scarce knew herself how much freer she drew breath. She set the room in order as best she could. She found the writing that Bjorn Gunnarsson had carved upon a log of the long wall. It was in Latin, and she could not read it all, but he named himself both Dominus and Miles, and she made out the name of his father's seat in Elvisel that he had lost for Ashild Gartersdatter's sake. Amidst the fine carvings on the high seat was his shield, bearing its device of the unicorn and the lily star leaves. A little while later, Kristin thought she heard a horse somewhere outside. She went to the outer room and peered forth. Down from the wooded slope above the farmstead came a tall black horse, harnessed to a load of firewood. Erland walked by its side, driving. One dog sat atop of the wood. Some others ran about the sleigh. Soton the Castilian strained at his collar and dragged the wood sleigh forward over the courtyard sward. One of the dogs dashed down the slope, barking. Erland, who had begun to unharness the horse, noticed now the flurry among the dogs, that something must be afoot. He took the wood axe from the load and walked toward the dwelling house. Kristin fled in again, dropping the latch behind her. She shrank into the wall of the fireplace and stood trembling and waiting. Erland strode in with the wood axe in his hand and the dogs tumbling over the threshold before and after him. They found the stranger forthwith and greeted her with a storm of barking. The first she saw was the wave of young red blood that rushed over his face, the fluttering quiver about his fine, weak mouth, the great eyes deep in the shadow of the brows. The sight of him took away her breath. She saw, indeed, the old growth of stubble upon his lower face. She saw that his unkempt hair was iron grey, but the colour came and went in his cheeks in hasty pulses as when they were young. He was so young and so comely. It was as though nothing had availed to quell him. He was miserably clad, his blue shirt dirty and ragged. Over it he wore a leathern jerkin, scarred and rubbed and rent at the lace holes, but fitting closely and pliant to the body's strong and gracious motions. His tight leathern breeches had a rent over the one knee, and the seam behind the other leg was burst. Yet never, more than now, had he seemed the son of chiefs and nobles. So fairly and easily he bore his tall, slim form, with the broad shoulders somewhat stooped, the long, fine limbs. He stood there, resting a little on one foot, one hand laid on the belt about his slender waist, the other, with the axe in it, hanging at his side. He had called the dogs back to him, and stood looking at her, went red and pale and said no word. For a good while they both stood dumb. At last the man spoke in a voice that wavered a little. "You have come here, Kristin?" "I was fain to see how it fared with you," she answered. "Oh, well, you have seen it then." He cast a glance about the room. "You see things are passably well with me here. It is good you chanced on a day when my house is trim and in order." He grew aware of the shadow of a smile upon her face. "Oh, maybe it is you who has set it in order," he said, laughing low. Erland laid aside the axe and sat down on the outer bench, with his back leaned against the board. Of a sudden he grew grave. "You stand there so. Is anything wrong at home? At Jorengard, I mean, with the boys?" "No." Now was her time to bring out what she had to say. "Our sons are thriving and doing well.
but they long so for you, Erland. This was my errand. I came here, husband, to beg you to come home to us. We miss you, all of us."
She cast down her eyes. "You look well, nonetheless, Kristin." Erland looked at her with a little smile. Red as though he had struck her, Kristin stood.
"'Tis not for that."
"No, I know it's not, because you think you are too young and fresh to live as a widow woman." Erland went on, when she stopped short. "I think but little good would come of it should I come back home, Kristin," he said soberly. "In your hands all goes well on your regard, I know that. You have fortune with you in your doings, and I am well content with the life I live here."
"'Tis not good for the boys that we should be at odds,"
she answered in a low voice.
"Oh."
Erland lingered on the word. "They are so young. I can scarce believe they take it so to heart that they will not forget it when they leave their childhood behind. I don't care if I tell you," he said with a little smile. "I meet them now and again." She knew it, but she felt as though it humbled her, and felt as it were he had meant it. He had thought she did not know it. The sons had never known that she knew, but she answered gravely.
"Then you know also that much on your guard is not as it should be."
"We never talk of such things," he said, smiling as before. "We go hunting together.
But you must be hungry and thirsty."
He leapt up.
"And you are standing too. Nay, sit down in the high seat, Kristin."
"Ah, do so, sweetheart. You shall have it all to yourself." He fetched in the milk and the cheese, and brought out bread, butter, and dried meat. Kristin was hungry, and yet more thirsty, but she found it hard to swallow down the food. Erland ate hastily and slovenly, as had always been his wont when he was not with strangers, so he was soon done. He talked of himself the whole time. The folk down the hill here tilled his land and brought him milk and a little food. For the most part he lay out on the fells hunting game and fishing. However, he said on a sudden, he had thoughts now of faring from the land, seeking service with some outland chieftain.
"Oh, no, Erland."
He looked at her quickly and searchingly, but she said no more. It began to grow dark in the room. Her face and head linen shone palely against the dark wall. Erland rose and made a fire in the fireplace. Then he sat down aslant on the outer bench, turned towards her. The red glare from the fire flickered over his form.
But that he could even think of such a thing! He was nearly as old as her father had been when he died. And yet it was believable that he would do it one day, run after some such whimsy, off to seek for new adventures. "Don't you think it is enough," said the wife vehemently, "that you have forsaken the parish, and your sons and me, that you would flee the land from us now?"
"Had I known your thoughts about me, Kristin," said Erland gravely, "then I had gone forth from your manor long ago. But I understand now you have had much to bear from me."
"You know full well, Erland. You say my manor. But you have a husband's right over all that is mine."
She heard herself how faint of voice she grew. "Yes," answered Erland, "but I know myself I was an ill husband of my own good." He was silent a while. "Nakvi, I remember the time before he was born. You spoke of him that you bore beneath your girdle, that was to mount into my high seat after me. I see now, Kristin, it was hard for you.
best let things be as they are. And I thrive well in this life." Kristin looked around her in the darkening room, shuddering. The shadows filled every corner now, and the firelight danced. "I don't understand," she said, nearly sinking with heaviness, "that you can abide this house. Nothing have you to do, no one to bear you company. At the least you might get a house-carl, I think." "Ha! You mean that I should work the farm myself?" Erland laughed. "Oh, no, Kristin. You must know by now how little fit I am to play the farmer. I cannot sit quiet." "Quiet? Here surely you sit quiet enough, the long winter through." Erland smiled to himself, his eyes far off and strange. "Ah, when it is in that way, when I need not think of anything but what runs in my head, I can come and go as I like. And you know well it has ever been so with me, that when there's nothing to wake for, I can sleep. I sleep like a bear in its winter lair when it's no weather for the fells." "Are you never afraid to be alone here?" whispered Kristin. At first he looked at her as though he did not understand. Then he laughed. "Ha! Because folks say it is haunted. I have never marked anything. Sometimes I had been fain that my kinsman Bjorn would visit me. Do you remember that he said once he thought I would ill abide to feel a knife edge at my throat? I could even have a mind to answer the knight now that I was not greatly afraid when I had the rope about my neck." A long shudder passed through the woman's body. She sat there dumb. Erland rose. "I think it is time we went to rest now, Kristin." Stiff and cold, she watched Erland take the covering that lay over his armour, spread it on the bed, and turn it down over the dirty pillows. "It is the best I have," he said. "Erland!" She clasped her hands beneath her breast. She sought for something she might say to gain a little time yet. She was so afraid. Then she remembered the errand she was to fulfill. "Erland, I was given a message to bear to you. Simon asked me, when he lay dying, that I would greet you from him, and say he had repented every day of the words he said to you when last you parted. Unmanly he called them himself, and he begged that you would forgive him for them." Simon. Erland stood holding the bedpost with one hand, gazing down at the floor. "He is the man I least want to be reminded of." "I don't know what was between you," said Kristin. These words of Erland's seemed to her strangely heartless. "But it was strange and unlike Simon if it were, as he said, that he had shown him little-minded in his dealings with you. If it was, I think the blame was not all his." Erland shook his head. "He stood by me like a brother when my need was greatest," he said low, "and I took help and friendship at his hands. And I didn't know that all the time he could scarce endure me. I think it must have been easier to live in the old world, when two such fellows as he and I met together hand to hand, met on a holm, and put it to the trial of arms which should win the fair-haired maid." He took an old cloak from the bench and flung it over his arm. "Maybe you would have the dogs beside you tonight?" Kristin had risen. "Where are you going, Erland?" "Out to the barn to lie there." "No!" Erland stopped. He stood there, straight and slender and young, in the dim red light of the waning embers. "I dare not lie alone here, in this house. I dare not." Would you dare to lie in my arms then?"
She half saw his smile through the dusk and drooped beneath it.
"Are you not afraid I would crush you to death, Kristin?"
"Would that you might."
She sank into his arms.
When she awoke, she saw by the pane of glass that it must be day outside. Something lay crushingly heavy on her breast. Erland slept with his head upon her shoulder. He had laid one arm over her, and his hand was around her left arm. She looked at the man's iron grey hair. She saw her own small, shrunken breasts. Above and below them the high-arched curves of her ribs showed under the thin covering of flesh. A kind of terror came over her, while memory after memory arose from this night. In this house, they too, young no longer. Disquiet and shame took hold on her when she saw the livid patches upon her work-worn mother's arms, on her shrunken bosom. Wildly she caught at the coverlid and would have covered herself. Erland awoke, started up on his elbow, stared into her face. His eyes were coal-black from sleep.
"I thought—"
He threw himself down beside her again. A deep, wild tremor went through her whole being at the rejoicing and the fear in his voice.
"I thought I was dreaming."
She pressed her open lips upon his mouth and twined her arms about his neck.
Never had it felt so good."
Late in the afternoon, when the sunshine was yellow already and the shadows lay long over the green courtyard, they set out down to the beck to fetch water. Erland bore the 2 great pails. Kristin walked by his side, slender, straight and lissom. Her head linen had slipped down and lay around her shoulders. Her hair shone bare and brown in the sunlight. She felt it herself when she shut her eyes and lifted her face against the light. She had grown red in the cheeks. The lines of her face had softened. Each time she glanced at him, she sank her gaze, overcome, when she saw in Erland's face how young she was. Erland thought that he would bathe. While he went a little farther down, Kristin sat on the green sward, leaning her back against a stone. The fell beck trilled and gurgled her into a doze. Now and then, when the midges and gnats touched her skin, she opened her eyes a little and brushed them off. Down among the sallows around about the pool, she caught a glimpse of Erland's white body. He stood with his foot upon a stone, rubbing himself with wisps of grass. She closed her eyes again and smiled in happy weariness. She was strengthless as ever against him. The man came and flung himself on the grass before her, with dripping hair and the chill of the water upon his red mouth when he pressed it into the palm of her hand. He had shaved and found a better shirt, but this one too was none too brave. Laughing, he took hold on it under the armpits where it was tattered. "You could have brought me a shirt when you finally came north here at the last."
"I shall set about sewing and hemming a shirt for you as soon as I get home, Erland,"
she answered, smiling, and passed her hand across his brow. He grasped it. "You shall never go from here again, my Kristin." The woman did but smile and answered nothing. Erland dragged himself a little way as he lay on his belly. Under the bushes in the damp shade grew a cluster of small, white, starry flowers. The flower leaves were veined with blue like a woman's breast. In the midst of each blossom was a little blue-brown boss. Erland plucked every one. "You that know about such things, Kristin, I think you know a name for these."
"'Tis freesia grass."
"No, Erland, She flushed and put away his hand, as he would have stuffed the blooms into her bosom. Erland laughed and lightly bit the white petals one by one. Then he laid all the blossoms in her open hand and closed up her fingers over them. "Do you remember when we walked in the garden of the Hofvinspittel? You gave me a rose?" Kristin shook her head slowly, smiling a little. "No, but you took a rose from out of my hand." "And you let me take it. And so it was you let me take you, Kristin, as meek and gentle as a rose. Afterwards you pricked me sometimes till the blood came, my sweet." He threw himself forward into her lap and laid his arms about her waist. "Last night, Kristin. It did no good, did it? I didn't let you sit there demurely waiting." Kristin bent her head and hid her face against his shoulder. On the fourth day they had taken harbour in the birchwood among the hillocks above the farm. For on that day the tenant was carrying the hay, and without having spoken of it, Kristin and Erland agreed that no one need know she was with him. He went down to the houses once or twice to fetch food and drink, but she sat on in the heather up among the stunted birches. From where they sat, they could see the man and the woman toiling home, bearing the loads of hay upon their backs. "Do you remember," asked Erland, "that time you promised me that, when I finished up as a crofter away among the fells, then you would come and keep house for me? You were going to keep 2 cows and a few sheep and goats." Kristin laughed, playing with his hair. "What do you think your sons would say, Erland, if their mother fled the parish and forsook them in that way?" "I think they would be fain enough to be their own masters on Jorengard," said Erland, laughing. "They are old enough for it. You know, Gout is a good farmer, young as he is, and Narkvi is well nigh a man." "Oh, no," the mother laughed quietly. "'Tis true he thinks so himself. All 5 of them do, I think. But the lad lacks something of a man's wit." "If he takes after his father, maybe it will come to him late, or never," answered Erland. He smiled slyly. "You think you can still hide your children behind your skirts, Kristin? Narkvi became a father up here this summer. You did not know that, I'm sure." "No!" Kristin sat there, red and aghast. "Yes, but it was stillborn, and I am sure the boy will think twice ere he comes thither any more. It was the widow of Paul's son, here at Haugsbrecken. She said it was his, and he wasn't wholly to blame, I think, however the matter stood. Yes, such old folk are we now, you and I." "How can you talk so, when your son has brought on him trouble and shame?" It cut her to the heart that the man could talk so lightly, and that it seemed to be a jest in his eyes, that she had known nothing of this. "What would you have me say?" asked Erland as before. "The lad is 18 years old. You can see yourself now it does little good for you to go about keeping watch on your sons as though they were children. When you come up hither to me, we must see to getting him wed." "Do you think it will be an easy thing for us to find Narkvi an equal match?" "No, husband. After this, I think you must come home with me and help to guide the lads." Erland raised himself sharply on his elbow. "That I will not do, Kristin. A stranger in your country I am, and always will be. No man there remembers anything of me but that I was doomed a traitor to king and country. Didn't it occur to you, those years I lived on Jorengard, that I was unhappy? At home in Skaun I was wont to count for something more amongst folk. even at that time, in my youth, when the tale of my evil life was buzzed abroad, when I lay under the church ban, none the less I was Erland Nicolausson of Huseby. Then came the time, Kristin, I had the fortune to show the folk yonder north of the fells that wholly unworthy of my forefathers I was not. No, I tell you, here on this little croft I am a free man. No one gapes at my doings or talks behind my back. Listen to me, Kristin, my only love. Stay with me. Never shall you have cause to repent it. Here is a better place than Huseby was at any day. I don't know how it is, Kristin. I was never glad or light of heart there, not when I was a child, and never since. It was hell while I had Aline with me, and you and I were never glad at heart together there. Yet God the Almighty knows I have loved you each day and each hour I have known you. Bewitched, I'm sure, the manor was. Mother was wrung to death there, and my father was always an unhappy man. Here it is good to be, Kristin, if only you will be with me. As true God died for us upon the cross, I hold you as dear today as that night you slept beneath my cloak, the night after Margaret's Mass. And I sat and looked at you, pure and fresh and young, an untouched blossom that you were. Kristin answered, Do you remember, Erland, too? You prayed that night that I should never have to weep a tear for your sake. Yes, and God and all the saints in heaven know that I meant it. And yes, it is true, it fell out otherwise. Maybe they had to. But that is what happens when we live in this world. But I loved you when I wrought you evil, and I loved you when I wrought you good. Stay here, Kristin. Have you never thought about this? She asked, gently as before. That it may well make your son's lot harder to have their father talked of in the way you say. Flee to the hills from the parish talk. They cannot, all 7 of them. Erland looked down. They are young, he said, comely and gallant lads. They will make a way for themselves yet. We, Kristin, we have not so many years before us ere we grow old and grey. Are you going to waste the time while you are yet fair and fresh and fit to enjoy life, Kristin? She cast her eyes down before the giddy gleam in his. In a little while she said, Have you forgotten, Erland? The 2 of our sons are little children. What would I be worth as a mother if I forsook Lavrans and Munin? You must bring them up here, then. If Lavrans would not rather live with his brothers, he's not so much a little boy any more either. Is Munin as comely as ever? The father asked, smiling. Yes, said the mother, he is a fair child. Thereafter they sat long, saying nothing. And when again they spoke, it was of other things. She woke in the grey of dawn next morning, as she had waked each morning up here, lay and heard the horses stamping outside the house wall. She had Erland's head fast in her arms. The other mornings, when she awoke in this grey and early hour, she had been gripped by the same fear and shame as on the first. She had striven to stifle them. Were they not a wedded pair, at odds, who had now made up their quarrel? Could nothing better happen to the children than that their father and mother should make friends again? But this morning she lay striving to remember her sons. For it was as though a spell was on her. Erland had spirited her away and brought her up here, straight from the woods of Gerderud,
where he had taken her into his arms the first time. They were so young. It could not be true already she had borne this man 7 sons, that she was mother to tall grown men. It seemed as though she must have lain here in his arms and but dreamed the long years they had lived as man and wife at Huseby. All his reckless words lured her and echoed in her. Giddy with fear, she felt as though Erland had swept from off her the 7-fold burden of her charge. Thus must it be with a young mare when she stands unsaddled upon the satyr pasture ground. Pack and saddle and headgear are gone from her. Against her blow the winds and the airs of the uplands. She is set free to graze the tender mountain grass, free to run as far as she will over all the upland wastes. And at the same time she longed already, sweetly and yearningly, right willing to bear a new burden. Already she yearned with a little tender dizziness towards him who should abide next to her heart for 9 long months. She had known it full surely from the first morning she awoke up here in Erland's arms. Along with the hard, dry, scorching fever in her mind, barrenness had passed away from her. She bore Erland's child in her womb, and with a strangely tender impatience, her soul stretched forward towards the hour when it should be brought forth into daylight. Those great sons of mine have no need of me, she thought. To them I seem but doting and troublesome. We'll just stand in their way, this little one and I. No, I cannot part from here. We must stay here with Erland. I cannot go. Yet nonetheless, as they sat together at their morning meal, she said that she must go home now to her children. It was of Lavransdatter she was thinking. They were so old now that she was abashed when she thought of them dwelling up here with Erland and her, and perhaps looking with wondering eyes at their father and mother grown so young again. But she could not do without those two. Erland sat gazing at her while she spoke of her journey home. At last he spoke with a flitting smile. "Well, if that is what you want, then you must go." He made ready to bear her company on the way, and he rode with her right down through the gorge into Sill, until he caught a glimpse of the church roof over the pine tops. Then he bade her farewell. At the last he was still smiling, a roguishly secure smile. "You know well, Kristin, whether you come by night or by day, whether I have to wait for you short time or long, I shall welcome you as if you were the Queen of Heaven come down to my croft from the skies." She laughed. "With such great matters I dare not meddle. But I think you know, my love, great will be the joy in your house the day the master returns home." He shook his head, laughing a little. Smiling, Erland leaned over as they sat on horseback side by side, and kissed her many, many times. And between the kisses he looked at her with his laughing eyes. "Well, we must see then," he said at last. "Which of us two is the more stubborn, my sweet Kristin? This will not be our last meeting. We both know that, you and I." As she rode by the church, a little shudder ran through her. It was as though she were coming home from the hall of the Mountain King, as though Erland were the Mountain King himself and could not pass the church and the cross on the green. She drew rein. She had a great urge to turn around and ride after him. Then she looked out over the green grassy slopes, down upon her own fair manor with meadows and tilled fields, and the river sweeping in shining loops down through the dale. The mountains rose in a warm blue haze. The heavens were full of bellying summer clouds. It was madness. There at home with his sons was his place. He was no knight of fairy, but a Christian man, full as he was of mad-brained moods and thoughtless whims. Her wedded husband, with whom she had borne both good and ill. He was dear to her, so dear, even as he had tempted her with his wayward fancies. She must bear with him. Since she could not live without him, she must strive on and suffer dread and insecurity as best she could. She did not think it would be long before he came after her, now that again they had been together.